So last week I finished the David Ash series by James Herbert. The first book was Haunted, then Ghosts of Sleeth, and the last one was just named Ash. I really enjoyed this trilogy. I think, if the trilogy was just a book, merging all these books together into just one, maybe I'd say into one story, I'd say this is my favorite so far by James Herbert. Yeah, and talking about the books that I liked best, I'd say book number 2 was my favorite. I think it's my favorite James Herbert book that I've read so far. I really enjoyed the whole concept of it, the paranormal investigator, and the fact that he's not a believer, that he's there to debunk everything. I really enjoyed that concept. It's actually just in book number 1 that he's just a debunker and not really an investigator, but in book 2 and 3 he becomes more of a true believer, and he becomes kind of a real investigator and not just a paranormal debunker as in the first book. Actually, I'll be talking more about the books in just a minute, but I just wanted to say that book number 2 was really my favorite. Then after that, I really enjoyed book number 1, and book number 3 is my least favorite of the 3 books. That being said, though, it's still one of my favorite James Herbert books, so it's saying a lot. It's just that book number 3 was a bit slower than book 1 and 2, which is a weird thing for James Herbert from what I've read so far, actually, because usually it's more straight to the point and there's a lot of action usually, but in Ash there is a lot of action, but more towards the end of the book. That being said, though, it's kind of this huge build up. It's not a slow burn because it still has that James Herbert pacing, but it's a bit slower than what I'm used to read from him in book number 3. But that being said, it was still a quite enjoyable read. It's just that it took me more time than maybe it should have to read book number 3, actually. On with the story. So in book number 1, we're following David Ash in one of his investigations. So the events take place at this mansion called Edbrook. It's the more gothic novel in the trilogy, actually, because of that. It takes place in that old manor filled with ghosts, and we don't know what the extent of these ghosts are until the end. And it has this plot twist at the end that we don't really see coming, which was really good. Actually, I really enjoyed that. Only reason why it's not my favorite is only because book number 2 was just this much better. Actually, it takes place in this small town called Sleeth, so that's why the Ghosts of Sleeth, and there's a bunch of ghosts from the get-go, that small English village. And I always pictured this, typical English small village in my mind when I was reading Ghost of Sleeth, and it added more to that weird sensation of unease in Ghost of Sleeth, which I really enjoyed. Once again, you could say it's kind of a gothic horror novel, but it's, instead of this castle or manor, it's an entire village that's haunted. I really enjoyed that one. The only thing that I didn't really like in that was the whole satanic aspect to it, but it's more in the background in here than it is in book number 3, which is once again why I didn't connect it that much with book number 3. Besides, the whole pacing thing, there's this weird pacing, but also all that satanic ritual aspect to it that I don't really connect with, unfortunately. It has that more to the front in book number 3, which is something that I didn't really like. But also in book number 3 you have all this aspect of conspiracy that I don't connect with that at all, which is a shame because it could have been better. And I don't mind all the secret society thingy that's there. It's just that he goes a bit too far with it, and it fell a bit short in book number 3. In book number 2 it had just the right amount of it. There was this not underground, but this secret society in book number 2 also, but it's more in the background. It's not that relevant to the story because the ghosts are just there to act revenge. You have the same thing in book number 3, but in book number 3 it has more to do with the whole secret society thingy and satanic ritual and all of that. So this is why book number 3 was not as good in my opinion. But book number 3 takes place in this castle called Comreich. Once again, you have this really gothic setting, but it's less gothic than book number 1, I'd say, because the castle is not as relevant a character as Ed Brooke in book number 1. Because in gothic, places are character. It tries to be in book 3, the castle tries to be a character, but the character is not as good as Ed Brooke in book number 1. Ed Brooke is so much better, and you have all this ambiguity in book number 1 about, is this real? Is David Ash going to debunk everything as just not ghosts, essentially? But book number 3, there's no questions asked. From the get-go, that there are ghosts in there. So maybe that's why also, book number 3 is not as good as book 1 and 2, because you no longer have this aspect of ambiguity that book 1 and 2 had. Book number 2 has less ambiguity than book number 1 because you kind of know from the get-go that ghosts are there in Sleeth, but the ghosts are scarier in Sleeth than they are in Comreich Castle, which is weird because in Comreich Castle you get the feeling that the stakes are higher, but I just felt like the stakes were just a bit too high maybe in book number 3. So yeah, there you have it. But still, really fun trilogy, one that I really enjoyed. If I go back to it, I might read book 1 and 2. I don't think I'll come back to book number 3 just because of how underwhelming it felt, unfortunately. Maybe it's just because I missed something. Maybe I spent too much time with it. That could be it also, because I read this book in 3 weeks. Usually a book this size, I read it at like a week or a week and a half, but I spent 3 weeks reading that. So maybe that's the problem I had with the book. I don't really know. We'll see, down the line if I ever come back to book number 3, but I might come back to 1 and 2 because I really enjoyed both these books. That's gonna be it for this review. Thank you if you've made it this far in the video. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one.